And good evening. It's December 24th, 2024, and we're continuing our discussion collection in our Outside the Class series. This series, it's from the Bible Project, covers the entire TaNaK, the Old Testament. On TheDustyFeet.com, in the Outside the Class section, all of those source videos, they are set up for your review. Because the intent of Outside the Class, for you to listen to that in-class lecture first. The lectures, again, they can all be found on the source video playlist. Because we're going to try to keep these to about 15 minutes. Really, we just want to make them easy to catch up on. So we're on a quest, scroll by scroll, book by book, a journey through this collection, but with a fun and different twist on Outside the Class, on the Dusty Feet. And before we forget, if you find these kinds of podcasts useful, it's when you click that subscribe button. Those reminders, they just help you. But also, if you think that might be useful to others, that's when you click that like button, because that is how YouTube chooses to share these to more people, if they wish. So in this series, we're going to cover the entire TaNaK, the Old Testament, in the original order of this collection, the Hebrew Scriptures order. So as we've gotten past the first 5, things could get interesting. Remember, the videos we're going to discuss, they're just the tip of the iceberg. They are part of a learning series that I highly recommend, and they can all be found on the Bible Project website. Because we're going to ask all kinds of questions about all kinds of things. Answers? We'll see. Joshua, Yehoshua, this is part 1. I like how Tim briefly looks at this scroll, the first one after the Torah. It makes sense since it picks up where we left off. This is the beginning of a really good sequel. So one of the points Tim makes very early in the video, it concerns the purpose of the instructions to show all of the other nations what God is like. I like that. Made me think a second. I said, if we think these instructions are no longer important, that raises another question. We're going to address that later. But if this is the purpose, I tend to lean that direction, then following them would be showing God's character. And I think this would do that. And I think that's the point of the scroll. The previous 5 scrolls set us up for this story. I mean, the whole point of the previous scrolls is to get us to where we're at. We're in the land promised to Abraham from a covenant long ago. I think at times we forget something. We know Joshua doesn't forget it because there's still other people in the land. We see that in the story from the first spy visit. And we know that there are people in this land, and those people, they need to be pushed out of the land before everything that's going to happen in the land can happen. Does that make sense? In other words, the people there, they have to be scooched out. And I think as we progress further into the scrolls, that one of the challenging parts of this scroll is that the people need to be removed from the story. Because this brings us to a point where things that happen, I think they might make us uncomfortable. Yeah. I think sometimes that's worth examining, especially when this particular one happens to be the authority that's going to be in the land and who says what to do. You know, depending on where you are in the world, trust me, there are all different things going all around the world every day that we're not aware of. But a lot of it has to do with who has authority on that particular part of the planet. When we're on the side of the part fighting to win, say, independence for said space, we seem to support it somewhat, right? But over the years, we've seen that take many different forms, even here in our little section that we call that old United States of America. oddly enough. We even put God on our sticker when we do what we do and have done what we've done in our past. And it's what I will quickly admit is a checkered past in our own American history. But in this story, people in the land, they need to leave. This is where we get some interesting things to think about. So I want to stretch our minds a bit as we investigate this, because it's worth setting this up as we examine this scroll and all the stories that follow. Let me see, how can I express this? We tend to want to separate our church and state, especially in democracy. We don't want the two to mix. We want to keep them separate. We don't want them to affect each other, meaning one doesn't dominate or drive the other. But the time we're looking at and the stories we're reading, they're almost the opposite. It's impossible not to separate the two. In other words, we have a people group and its makeup, what it does, who it is, the gods they follow determine their practices. How the people live in the community is how that group interacts with themselves, and the expectations of those outside coming into and live in that community. So when we read about these different people groups, the Moabites, for example, we know that they are all identified by the gods they follow, the practices that accompany them, and how they live every day, right? It's not an ID card. It's not a passport. It's a lifestyle. And I think we struggle with this at times. We have a problem separating what we want from how we live, right? Today, we have ID cards and passports that let folks know where we're from. But that might not mean we might not all act the same way as all the folks do in that place. Our ID card, our hats, our t-shirts, our jewelry, they don't identify us. They're just statements. We no longer identify as a church state. Yeah. We separate ourselves. We act differently. Whereas in these stories, their actions, what they do, are their ID cards and the gods they choose to follow. Just because you give somebody a title says that they're from somewhere. So we go there and say, okay, but they can be something else, meaning they can act differently, a particular way, even though they're from a particular place. But here, in these stories, to call yourself, as we have this list of these different people groups, say Moabite again as an example, everything that goes with them is in the practice. In other words, they're the same. It's not, you can't take them apart. They're one. So I think it's hard to imagine that sometimes you can, the community I lived in did this or does that. Although I don't live there anymore, I still call myself that. I just don't do that. Didn't work, because back then someone did that. Wait a minute. Someone did do that. They left that. We have a great example of that. Because further along in the scrolls, I know we're going to get to Ruth's scroll, where she forsakes what she was, Moabite, and she becomes a follower of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. She acts differently. So when we read a word for these people groups, I think we don't understand what we're looking at. Because all of these groups, their stories, they are wrapped up in their gods. Everything that falls under what makes them that community, that's what we're talking about. So when they hear it, those children of Israel, they are very much aware of these people groups. And if they don't understand them, at least in my community, because what they're going to bring in is going to be against how I want my community to live. Yeah. In their time, right? So does that make sense? You're going to come in. And they're going to come in and they're going to bring in their practices. They're not going to forsake their other gods. They bring those gods into the community. They want you to become a part of them. And God told them it's the opposite of that. I remember when I was a kid, you'd hear stories about, say, tribes in a rainforest where they were cannibals. And you realized, hey, if I'm going to live in that community, if I live in that community and don't want to be a cannibal, then why am I being part of that community? So I probably want to live there. And I think maybe there's a pretty good chance that I don't want a cannibal living in my community. Because what they do in their community is how they view their gods. I mean, that's really part of the equation with child sacrifice. And that for God, it's not what he wants brought in, right? And this is what people said. The people who practice this are the most dangerous to you. And you need to make sure they are pushed out of the land. Yeah? So I want to discuss a term here. Tim mentions it later in the video. We're going to explore it further there, but I want to bring it up now so we can begin exploring this frame of thinking, right? And the word he used was hyperbole. I think it's one of those words we don't use often, but we always do hyperbole. Did you catch what I just did? I used a hyperbole to explain this because I said we do it all the time. It's not true, is it? Hyperbole. It's a noun. It's rhetoric, right? It's an obvious and intentional exaggeration. And an extravagant statement or a figure of speech, right, that we use, not intended to be taken literally, as in to wait for an eternity. So I guess one of the questions that can cause us some challenges and heart palpitations is, does the scripture have this? I believe very much so. It has to be part of it, especially when you get into the poetry, as we'll get into later. But we even saw it in Jonah, and we even talked about it in our Jonah series. So Tim begins to get to the point, which I believe is very important, that our recognition is that when we say phrases like the ones we're going to read about here, and we say them all the time, they're going to say something that is going to cause us to think. Because I think there's a little bit of a misunderstanding here. So we need to keep this in mind. We need to know, and often don't, who these people really are. And then also then to view them through the lens of the people that are looking at them. Okay? We need to think of this as being the children of Israel looking at the Moabites. Understanding when you say that term, right? Everything that they are, everything that they do is how they are viewing them. And I think when you do that, it may help us see the story differently. I think then we'll read the story and see it as it is, looking back at their direction. I think we would have had a different story if they'd have followed God's direction and removed all their practices from the land. This scroll of Joshua, Yehoshua, is a collection of stories that plot out the journey, the challenges, the direction that the children of Israel take as they enter the land. And as we see, I think challenging, I think it's an understatement. So, thanks for being with us for part 1 of Joshua tonight on another Outside the Class episode on the Dusty Feet.